I am Maya, 34 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I have been a ghost to my own family. Forsaken at a gas station for a twisted $20 bet when I was 15, I erased my existence and built a life they could never touch. As a senior forensic accountant for the federal government, I spend my days dismantling corporate money laundering rings. I never looked back until today. 29 frantic missed calls from my mother just shattered my peace, followed by a desperate demand. They think they can use me one last time to take the fall for their crimes. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Now let me tell you how I destroyed their empire without breaking a single law. The glass walls of my downtown office overlooked the city, but my eyes were locked on my cell phone, buzzing violently on the mahogany desk. The screen flashed the same number it had flashed 28 times in the past hour. I pressed the speaker button. Maya, pick up the phone. My mother Brenda shrieked through the sleek office. Her voice dripped with the same toxic entitlement she had 20 years ago. Your little temper tantrum is over. I emailed you a document this morning. You need to print it, sign it, and deliver it to your sister by noon. The family is busy and we do not have time to hold your hand. Before the voicemail could even end, the heavy glass door to my office was violently shoved inward. Did you not hear the woman? I looked up. Standing in my doorway, flanked by a very nervous-looking security guard, was my older sister, Chloe. She was dripping in designer clothes with a massive diamond tennis bracelet clanking against her wrist. Right behind her was Bradley, her white husband. His face was flushed red with unearned authority. "Mom, they bypassed the reception," the guard started to say. "It is fine, Dave," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Shut the door behind them." Chloe marched forward, slapping a thick manila folder directly onto my keyboard. "Mom said she emailed it, but since you want to play hard to get, we brought the hard copies. Sign page 4 and page 7. Bradley leaned over my desk, planting his knuckles on the glass, trying to physically loom over me. "Listen, Maya," he said, affecting a tone that made my skin crawl. "I know you have been out of the loop doing whatever it is you do, answering phones or whatever. But in a Black family, loyalty is everything. Your mother is stressed. Your sister is running a multi-million-dollar salon empire. You owe them this signature. It is just a standard proxy for the family trust." I did not even blink. I simply stared at the folder. "A standard family proxy?" I asked quietly. "Yes," Chloe snapped, rolling her eyes and checking her reflection in my window. "It just transfers some old tax liabilities. Do not try to read it because you will not understand the corporate jargon anyway. Just sign it so we can get back to our actual lives." I slowly opened the folder. I did not need to read it to understand it. At 34, I was a senior forensic accountant for the federal government. I spent 60 hours a week dismantling corporate money laundering rings and shell companies for the Internal Revenue Service. My eyes scanned the first paragraph. I took a deep breath and let the reality of their audacity wash over me. They marched into a federal building demanding a signature without even knowing who they were talking to or what I actually did for a living. The arrogance was astounding, but entirely expected from people who treated my existence as a joke. I looked at Bradley, who was tapping his expensive watch impatiently. Chloe stood crossing her arms, loudly sighing, as if my presence was an inconvenience. They really believed I was just some low-level secretary struggling to make ends meet. They believed I was desperate enough for their approval to sign a blind legal document without asking questions. I picked up my silver pen and let it hover over the signature line, just to watch their eyes light up with greedy anticipation. Bradley smirked, thinking his loyalty speech worked. Chloe let out a breath of relief, already turning toward the door as if the transaction was complete. But I did not write my name. Instead, I tapped the pen against the glass desk, creating a sharp, ringing sound that broke their delusion. This was not a proxy. It was an absolute admission of extreme legal guilt. It stated that I, Maya, was the sole operating manager of a shell corporation. It bound me to accept liability for all undocumented financial discrepancies over the past 5 years. They were trying to frame me for federal tax evasion to save their skins. I slowly closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. I leaned back into my chair and finally made direct eye contact with my sister. "Who told you I was just a receptionist, Chloe?" Chloe frowned, her eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice faltering slightly under my gaze. I stood up slowly, letting the heavy silver federal badge clipped to my blazer catch the bright office lights. "I asked who told you I was just a secretary. Because if you are going to walk into a federal building and ask a federal agent to sign a confession for wire fraud, you should probably bring a better lawyer than your unemployed husband." I reached over and picked up my office phone. "You have exactly 10 seconds to leave before I call security." Chloe let out a sharp laugh, throwing her head back in forced amusement. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my natural curls and the plain gray blazer I wore over a simple black dress. "A secretary or a federal agent," she sneered, crossing her arms. "It does not matter, Maya. You still look like you shop at a discount rack in a strip mall. You sit in this sterile office pretending to be important, but you have absolutely nothing to your name. Look at me. I own a luxury salon that brings in millions of dollars a year. I have a staff of 30 people who cater to my every demand. And Bradley here is a highly successful venture capitalist managing commercial portfolios you could not even comprehend. We are building a massive generational legacy, while you are pushing paper for a mediocre government salary." Bradley stepped forward, puffing out his chest and attempting a swagger that looked completely ridiculous on his pale frame. "Come on now, Maya," he said, slipping into a forced urban cadence that made my skin physically crawl. "Do not be like that. We are all family here. At the end of the day, blood is thicker than water. You have to recognize the hustle. Your mother held it down for years after you pulled that disappearing act. You ran away when you were only 15 years old. You left a single black mother crying and wondering if her child was dead or alive in the cold streets. That is cold, Maya. That is not how our people operate. You owe her this much. You owe your successful sister this much. Sign the paper and make things right so we can all move forward." I placed my phone back on the receiver and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk. The sheer audacity of their rewritten history was almost impressive. "I did not run away, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. "Let us get the story straight, since you seem to love speaking on family history you know absolutely nothing about. I was not some rebellious teenager who packed a bag and sneaked out a bedroom window in the middle of the night." Chloe rolled her eyes loudly. "Here we go again with the endless victim routine," she muttered, waving her manicured hand. I ignored her and kept my eyes locked on Bradley. "It was the middle of winter," I continued. "My mother Brenda and my dear sister Chloe took me on a road trip to visit our cousins in Atlanta. On the way back, Mom stopped at a filthy gas station somewhere in rural Georgia. I was sleeping in the back seat. She woke me up and told me to go inside and buy her a pack of cigarettes. When I walked out of those sliding glass doors, the parking lot was completely empty. The car was gone. Bradley blinked, his fake swagger faltering for a fraction of a second. I stood there for 6 hours in the freezing cold. I said every word, precise and cutting. I called my mother 29 times from a payphone. She never answered a single call. 2 years later, I found out from a relative that Brenda and Chloe had made a $20 bet on whether I could figure out how to navigate a Greyhound bus station by myself. They drove home and went to sleep in their warm beds. They abandoned me 500 miles away from home over a crisp $20 bill. So do not stand in my federal office and lecture me about Black family loyalty or a mother crying over her lost child. Brenda shed no tears. She simply saved money on groceries. Chloe slammed her hand against the glass partition. "You are completely delusional, Maya. You have always been crazy and making up malicious lies to get attention. Mom looked everywhere for you. She filed police reports. She prayed for you every single Sunday at our church. You were a troubled kid on heavy drugs, and you ran away because you could not handle her strict discipline. Now you sit here acting like you are somehow better than us. You are pathetic and sad. The security guard shifted uncomfortably by the door, clearly realizing he had stepped into a deeply personal family crossfire. I looked at Dave the guard and gave him a curt professional nod. Dave, please escort them to the lobby. If they refuse, call the police and have them removed for trespassing on federal property. Chloe gasped incredibly loudly, with her face turning a very deep shade of crimson. You would not dare call the cops on your very own flesh and blood, she hissed at me. Try me, I replied, sitting back down and turning my attention to my computer monitor. Get out of my office now. Bradley grabbed Chloe by the arm, pulling her back before she could cause a physical scene that would actually get them arrested. Fine. He spat, his face contorting into an ugly sneer. Have it your way, Maya. You want to be a hard-headed fool? Then take the consequences. The bank is going to foreclose on our grandmother's house in exactly 24 hours if this liability transfer is not filed. We are trying to save the family home, and you are throwing it all away over some ancient grudge. Sign the paper by tomorrow morning, or you are completely dead to us forever. He dragged Chloe out of the office, and Dave quickly shut the heavy glass door behind them. I stood up and locked the deadbolt. My hands were perfectly steady. I did not shed a single tear for them. Instead, I sat back down at my desk and pulled up the highly restricted Federal Internal Revenue Service database. I typed in my own social security number and hit enter, ready to absolutely destroy their entire empire forever. The screen flickered as the Federal Internal Revenue Service database processed my query. I bypassed the standard security protocols using my senior clearance level. The system took exactly 4 seconds to pull up the financial history attached to my social security number. What appeared on the monitor was not a simple list of unpaid taxes. It was a sprawling, meticulously constructed criminal enterprise built entirely on my stolen identity. I did not waste time crying or feeling betrayed. My fingers flew across the keyboard, sending document after document to the high-capacity printer in the corner of my office. The machine whirred to life, spitting out pages of irrefutable evidence. I grabbed the first stack of papers. It was a court decree filed 19 years ago in Fulton County, Georgia. Brenda had not just abandoned me. She had legally erased my autonomy. A judge had granted her full conservatorship and power of attorney over my identity after she falsely testified that I was severely mentally unfit and a runaway addict who posed a danger to herself. Because I was not there to contest the hearing, she won by default. She owned my name. I walked back to the printer and pulled the next batch of documents. Using that fraudulent conservatorship, Brenda had systematically opened 5 premium credit cards in my name over the last 10 years. I scanned the itemized billing statements. The accounts were completely maxed out. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been spent on first-class flights to Paris, designer handbags, and daily transactions at Chloe's luxury salon. They were using my stolen credit to artificially inflate the revenue of my sister's failing business, making it look like a highly successful multi-million-dollar empire to outside investors. The printer spat out another thick stack of heavy legal paper. 2 residential mortgages appeared on the screen. The first was a massive commercial loan for the sprawling brick colonial house my family lived in. Brenda had refinanced the property 3 separate times, pulling out all the equity to fund her lavish church donations and country club memberships. The second mortgage was for a luxury penthouse downtown. I checked the public registry for the address. It was the exact same penthouse Chloe and Bradley constantly flaunted on their social media profiles. Neither of them owned it. I owned it, and the mortgage was 3 months past due. The sheer scale of the fraud was breathtaking. They had treated my social security number like an unlimited ATM machine. But the most damning piece of evidence was yet to come. I cross-referenced the corporate identification number for C&B Holdings, the company they desperately wanted me to sign over. The corporate registry loaded instantly. Brenda and Chloe had established the Shell Corporation 5 years ago. They had structured the company so that they were merely independent contractors receiving untaxed payouts, while I was listed as the sole proprietor and chief executive officer. Every single asset the family possessed, including the salon, the cars, and the real estate, was legally held by this corporation. They thought they were being incredibly smart by hiding their wealth behind my name to avoid paying property and income taxes. They assumed I was an uneducated runaway who would never find out. The trust fund also showed monthly withdrawal statements for a luxury car lease program. They were leasing brand new Mercedes-Benz vehicles every single year and writing off the monthly payments as essential corporate operating costs. The sheer arrogance of their spending habits made my blood boil. They expected the federal government to completely ignore their massive fraud. I scrutinized the tax filings submitted by C&B Holdings over the past half-decade. They had aggressively written off personal luxury expenses as corporate deductions. Chloe's diamond tennis bracelet was listed as a uniform expense. Bradley's expensive sports car was registered as a company delivery vehicle. Brenda had even expensed her lavish casino trips as corporate team-building retreats. They were openly mocking the federal tax code. As a forensic accountant, I had sent seasoned mafia bosses to prison for far less obvious financial crimes. The ignorance required to execute a scheme this poorly was almost insulting to my profession. I organized the tax returns into a separate folder designated for federal prosecution. I placed the fraudulent court conservatorship documents into another pile. Every single signature on these pages was forged by my mother. Every single document represented a separate felony count of wire fraud, identity theft, and perjury. I gathered the final piece of paper from the printer tray to uncover the immediate catalyst for their sudden panic. I scanned the bold text across the top of the government letterhead. The absolute truth became clear. The final printout was a formal notice of investigation from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The government was officially auditing C&B Holdings for massive tax evasion. The bold numbers at the bottom of the page outlined the total financial devastation. The fake corporation owed exactly $4,200,000 in back taxes, penalties, and accumulated interest. This was why Chloe and Bradley had stormed into my office demanding my signature on that proxy document. They knew the federal audit was closing in on them. If I had signed that paper this morning, I would have legally accepted full responsibility for the entire $4 million debt. I would have been taking the fall for their decades of reckless criminal behavior. As the legally documented owner, I would be the only one facing up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary while they walked away entirely free with all of the stolen assets. A slow, cold smile spread across my face as I stared at the federal audit notice. They brought a fake proxy to a federal forensic accountant. I picked up my secure office phone and dialed the Criminal Enforcement Division immediately. I had just placed the receiver back on its cradle after flagging the Shell Corporation file for immediate criminal review when my direct office line began to ring. I glanced at the caller identification display on my desk. It was a local phone number I had not seen in 20 long years, but the name attached to it was unmistakable. Shirley Jenkins, my mother's sister. I pressed the flashing green button and lifted the handset. Before I could even utter a single syllable of greeting, Aunt Shirley launched into a vicious, unhinged tirade that practically vibrated through the plastic speaker. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little tramp!" she screamed, her voice shrill and dripping with absolute venom. "Your mother is sitting in my living room right now crying her eyes out because of your selfish behavior. After everything she has done for you, after all the money she has poured into keeping you off the streets, you have the nerve to disrespect her and your sister like this." I leaned back in my office chair, perfectly silent, allowing her to exhaust her initial rage. "You are a bitter, jealous dropout," Shirley continued, her volume rising with every word. "You have always envied Chloe. You could not stand that she was destined for greatness, while you were destined for the gutter. Chloe built a luxury salon from the ground up with her bare hands. She works day and night to maintain a beautiful lifestyle, and you want to ruin it. Bradley told us how you acted in your office today, throwing papers around and refusing to sign a document to help your own flesh and blood. You make me sick, Maya." I kept my voice completely level. "Is that what they told you, Aunt Shirley? They told you I was throwing papers around my office today. Do not play smart with me, she snapped. We all know the truth about you. Your mother has been protecting your reputation for 20 years. She told us how you came crawling back a few years ago begging for money to fund your drug habits. She told the whole church congregation how she has been secretly paying for your rehabilitation facilities and sending you monthly checks just so you would not starve to death. She has sacrificed her own peace of mind to keep you alive, and this is how you repay her generosity. By refusing to sign a simple proxy to save the family home from a bank foreclosure. The sheer magnitude of my mother's lies was breathtaking. Brenda had not just stolen my identity to commit massive federal fraud. She actively constructed a detailed fictional narrative portraying me as a helpless junkie to garner sympathy from her peers. She used my fabricated addiction to explain to the family where all the stolen money was going. It was a masterful manipulation. They all believed she was a saint making sacrifices for her troubled child. You should be on your hands and knees thanking your sister, Shirley ranted, working herself into a frenzy. Chloe is a self-made millionaire. She is a pillar of the community. And you are just a leech trying to drag her down. You need to sign that paper, Maya. If you do not sign it by tomorrow morning, I will personally make sure you are permanently excommunicated from this family. No one will ever speak to you again. You will be cut off from the only people who ever cared about your pathetic life. I let her finish her entire rant. I waited for the heavy silence to settle over the phone line. The sound of her ragged breathing echoed through the receiver. She was expecting me to cry. She was expecting me to apologize and beg for forgiveness, just like the fabricated version of me Brenda had maliciously invented. You are an absolute disgrace to the family name, Shirley spat out. We are hosting the big Sunday family dinner this weekend at your mother's house. The entire congregation will be there. We were going to pray for your recovery, but now I am going to tell everyone exactly what kind of monster you really are. You are not welcome in that house, Maya. Do not even think about showing your face until you have signed that proxy and apologized to your mother in person. The picture was completely clear to me right now. They were holding court in my house. They were eating food bought with my maxed-out credit cards and praying for my fabricated soul in a dining room funded entirely by my stolen identity. They were wrapping themselves in fake religious righteousness while conspiring to send me to federal prison. I did not scream. I did not defend myself against the outrageous accusations of drug addiction or jealousy. I looked at the financial audit glowing on my monitor and found a specific line item buried in the bank statements from 3 years ago. I have one question for you, Aunt Shirley, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the line like a razor. Did Mom pay you back the $50,000 she borrowed from your retirement fund? The line went dead silent. I could hear a television playing in her living room, but Shirley had stopped breathing. Because according to the official bank records I am looking at right now, I continued speaking very slowly and clearly. She took that $50,000 and spent it on a down payment for Chloe's new sports car. Shirley did not utter a single word in response. Her righteous anger had been instantly vaporized by cold, hard financial terror. I gently placed the receiver back onto the phone base, ending the call. I opened my personal email account, found the digital invitation for the Sunday family dinner, and clicked the button to officially accept. I was going home. Sunday afternoon arrived with a heavy, suffocating humidity matching the dread in my chest. I pulled my modest sedan into the massive circular driveway of what used to be a simple brick colonial house. The property had been completely transformed since I last saw it 20 years ago. It now boasted a grand wrought iron gate, imported Italian marble fountains, and a fleet of luxury vehicles parked out front. Every single brick, every freshly planted hydrangea bush, and every custom window pane had been meticulously financed by the sweat of my stolen identity. I stepped out of my car, smoothing down the same gray blazer Chloe had mocked earlier this week. I did not need to dress in designer labels to know I was the wealthiest person walking onto this property. I owned every blade of grass beneath my feet. I walked up the grand stone steps and pushed the heavy oak door open without knocking. The entryway smelled of expensive catering and hypocritical righteousness. Dozens of people were now gathered in the massive sunken living room. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and a prominent flock of ladies from my mother's church congregation held crystal champagne flutes and balanced plates of roasted lamb. The moment my heels clicked against the imported hardwood floor, the lively chatter died instantly. The atmosphere dropped below freezing. Heads turned in unison, eyes darted up and down my frame. I could hear the aggressive whispering rippling through the crowd like a venomous wave. "Look at her," someone muttered from the corner. "She actually showed up." I heard she is still struggling with the substances. The sheer audacity of these people was laughable. I kept my chin held high and maintained a blank expression as I walked further into the lion's den. Suddenly the crowd parted. My mother Brenda descended the custom spiral staircase. She wore a ridiculous silk caftan dripping with heavy gold jewelry that she had undoubtedly expensed as a corporate uniform. She spotted me and her eyes widened in brief, genuine panic before she instantly slipped into her carefully practiced character, the long-suffering, saintly matriarch. "Oh, praise the Lord!" Brenda cried out, throwing her hands toward the vaulted ceiling. Her voice was loud enough to ensure every single church member heard her. "My prodigal daughter has returned to me." She rushed across the room, putting on a spectacular theatrical performance. She threw her arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a suffocating embrace. To the untrained eye, it looked like a tearful, beautiful family reunion. But the reality was entirely different. The moment Brenda's body pressed against mine, her demeanor shifted. Beneath the folds of her expensive silk caftan, her hands gripped my upper arms like steel vices. She dug her long, sharp acrylic nails directly into my skin, pressing hard enough to leave deep crescent-shaped bruises. She rested her cheek against mine, flashing a bright camera-ready smile to the surrounding guests while she spoke directly into my ear. Her voice was a barely audible, venomous hiss that contrasted sharply with the joyous tears streaming down her heavily contoured face. "What are you doing here, you ungrateful little witch?" she hissed, her smile never faltering for the audience. "I told you to send the documents in the mail. You have a lot of nerve showing your face in my home after the way you treated your sister." I kept my posture perfectly straight, refusing to flinch from the pain of her nails digging into my flesh. "I'm just here for the family dinner, Mom," I replied, matching her bright, fake smile. "I wanted to see exactly what you have done with the place." Aunt Shirley materialized right behind my mother, holding a glass of wine and glaring at me with open disgust. She looked me up and down, shaking her head theatrically. "We were just praying for you, Maya," Shirley announced loudly, drawing the attention of the church ladies. "We were asking the Lord to cleanse your troubled spirit and guide you away from your destructive habits. We know how hard your mother works to keep you afloat. It is a blessing she even lets you step foot in this beautiful sanctuary she built." "A sanctuary," I repeated, looking around at the vaulted ceilings and the expensive art hanging on the walls. That is a very interesting word for a house funded entirely by federal wire fraud. I kept my voice low enough that only Brenda and Shirley could hear. Brenda stiffened immediately. Her eyes darted around, checking to see if anyone else had heard my comment. She pulled back from the hug, releasing her painful grip on my arms. She grabbed my elbow forcefully, steering me away from the crowd and toward the swinging doors of the massive gourmet kitchen. Once the heavy kitchen doors swung shut behind us, the stifling silence was absolutely deafening. The vibrant party noise from the living room was completely muffled by the thick acoustic wall panels Brenda had recently installed. We were entirely alone now. Brenda dropped my elbow instantly, as if touching me burned her skin. She spun around, crossing her arms defensively over her chest while staring daggers right into my eyes. She pointed toward a sleek black granite countertop where a thick stack of legal papers rested neatly next to a heavy sterling silver pen. She closed the distance between us again, leaning in so close I could smell the overpowering scent of her expensive designer perfume. She delivered her final ultimatum with absolute venom. "Smile for the family," she whispered aggressively. "Sign the proxy paper sitting on the kitchen counter right now, and get out of my house before I have you arrested and thrown in jail for trespassing." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I looked at the pen resting on the granite counter and let a wide, genuinely terrifying smile spread across my face. Oh, I cannot wait to see the paperwork, Mom. Brenda snatched her hand away from the counter and aggressively pushed past me through the swinging kitchen doors. I took a deep, steadying breath and followed her back into the grand dining room. The massive mahogany table was already set with fine china and polished silver. Everyone scrambled to find their assigned seats. Brenda positioned herself at the head of the table like a reigning monarch. She directed me to sit at the far end next to a towering floral centerpiece that conveniently blocked me from most of the conversations. Chloe and Bradley sat directly across from me, radiating an obnoxious level of smug satisfaction. As the catering staff began serving the first course of roasted lamb and glazed root vegetables, Chloe immediately took control of the room. She spoke incredibly loudly, making sure her voice carried over the clinking of silverware. She spent the first 20 minutes detailing her upcoming luxury vacation to the Maldives. She constantly gestured with her left hand, making sure the massive diamond rings on her fingers caught the light from the crystal chandelier above us. I just do not know how I am going to manage being away from the salon for 2 whole weeks. Chloe sighed dramatically, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. It is so exhausting being a female business owner. Everyone constantly relies on you for everything. But Bradley insisted I needed a break. He said my empire practically runs itself now. A chorus of approving murmurs erupted from the church ladies sitting near Brenda. Aunt Shirley nodded vigorously, stabbing a piece of lamb with her fork. "You deserve it, baby," Shirley said loudly. "You have worked so hard to build that beautiful business from nothing. You are a shining example of what a strong Black woman can achieve when she stays on the righteous path." Chloe beamed at the compliment. She reached over and placed her hand affectionately on Bradley's arm. "And I have the most supportive husband in the world," she continued, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You all should have seen the surprise he got me for our anniversary last week. A brand new Porsche Cayenne, custom interior and everything. It was just delivered to the driveway yesterday." The table erupted into loud congratulations. Several cousins clapped, and Brenda wiped a fake tear of pride from her eye. Bradley puffed out his chest, leaning back in his velvet-upholstered dining chair with an insufferable smirk. He looked directly at me, his eyes full of condescending pity. He clearly wanted to establish dominance in front of the entire congregation. "Well, you know how it is," Bradley said loudly, addressing the entire table but keeping his eyes locked on mine. "When you achieve a certain level of financial freedom, you have to take care of your family. It is all about generational wealth and making smart corporate investments. Something I am sure Maya is trying to learn about right now." The lively conversation around the table suddenly ground to an awkward halt. The silence was thick and uncomfortable as all eyes shifted toward my end of the table. I continued calmly slicing my roasted lamb, ignoring the heavy stares. Bradley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the fine linen tablecloth. "Listen, Maya," he said, adopting that fake, sympathetic tone he used in my office. "Chloe and I were talking on the drive over here. We know things have been really tough for you. We know you have been struggling to find your footing and keep a steady job. We believe in second chances and we want to help." Chloe chimed in, nodding with exaggerated concern. "We really do, Maya. Family is family even when they make terrible life choices. It is our duty to lift you up from the bottom." So Bradley continued, raising his voice slightly to ensure the church ladies heard his profound generosity. "Chloe and I want to offer you a position at the salon. It is just a receptionist job, answering phones and sweeping the floors, but it pays minimum wage. It will give you some structure and help you get back on your feet. You could even learn a little bit about how a real legitimate business operates. We want to see you succeed, Maya. We really do." Aunt Shirley loudly cleared her throat. "That is incredibly generous of you, Bradley. I hope Maya understands what a massive blessing you are offering her. Most people would not hire someone with her troubled background." I watched the performance unfold with absolute clarity. They were attempting to publicly humiliate me while masquerading as my generous saviors. They wanted me to bow my head and accept their charity so they could feel superior while secretly forcing me to sign away my freedom to the Internal Revenue Service. The church ladies watched expectantly, waiting for my tearful display of gratitude. They waited for the broken drug addict to thank the wealthy, successful sister. It was a perfectly executed manipulation tactic. I placed my silver knife and fork down on the fine china plate. The metal clinked sharply, echoing throughout the quiet dining room. I picked up my crystal water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, making them wait. I looked at Bradley, who was currently grinning like a benevolent king. I looked at Chloe, who was staring at me with triumphant arrogance. I looked at Brenda, who was gripping her napkin tightly. "That is incredibly generous of you, Bradley," I said, my voice perfectly steady and carrying clearly across the long mahogany table. "I really appreciate you thinking of my financial well-being, especially since your brand new Porsche Cayenne was financed through a commercial vehicle loan under my name last Tuesday." The insufferable smirk vanished from Bradley's face instantly. Chloe dropped her fork onto her plate with a loud clatter. I picked up my knife and went back to calmly cutting my steak. "How is the interest rate on that loan, by the way?" I asked without looking up from my food, because with my excellent credit score, I would expect nothing higher than 4%. The entire dining table went completely silent. Brenda slammed her heavy crystal water glass down onto the mahogany table with such extreme force that the water spilled over the edges and soaked into the pristine white linen tablecloth. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the imported hardwood floor. Her face was contorted into a mask of exaggerated maternal concern that poorly concealed her rising panic. "Maya, what on earth are you talking about?" Brenda cried out, placing a hand dramatically over her chest. She looked around the table at the wide-eyed church ladies and the stunned relatives, making sure she had a captive audience. "Oh Lord, please help my child," Brenda wailed loudly. "She is having another one of her mental breakdowns. The delusions are starting again." I knew it was a terrible mistake to let her leave the rehabilitation facility so soon. She is hallucinating and making up wild stories because her brain is completely addled by the substances. Chloe immediately caught on to the performance. She covered her mouth with both hands, pretending to be entirely shocked and heartbroken. "Maya, please stop doing this to us," Chloe pleaded, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "You are embarrassing yourself in front of our entire congregation. Bradley works so hard to provide for this family, and you are sitting here making up insane lies about commercial vehicle loans. You really need professional medical help." Aunt Shirley stood up from her chair and pointed a commanding finger directly at me. "Do not ever dare speak to your sister and your brother-in-law like that," Shirley barked, her voice echoing through the massive dining room. "They just offered you a lifeline. They just offered to save you from the gutters, and this is how you repay their Christian charity. You are deeply sick in the head, Maya. You have let the devil take hold of your tongue, and you are trying to destroy the only people who have ever loved you." The church ladies began to murmur in collective agreement, nodding their heads and giving me looks filled with righteous pity and absolute disgust. Several of the aunts and uncles stood up, forming a physically intimidating wall of bodies around my end of the table. The atmosphere shifted from awkward silence to aggressive hostility in a matter of seconds. "You need to get down on your knees and pray for absolute forgiveness," Shirley commanded, stepping closer to my chair and looming over me. "You need to beg the Lord to cleanse your wicked, jealous heart. Your mother has sacrificed her entire life to protect you from your own destructive behavior, and you sit in her beautiful home spewing venom." Brenda walked around the large mahogany table, her silk caftan flowing behind her. She grabbed my upper arm with the same painful vice grip she had used in the entryway. Her long acrylic nails dug into my skin as she forcefully tried to pull me up from my chair. "We are going into the study right now," Brenda hissed through clenched teeth, her fake maternal concern vanishing the second she was close enough to whisper. "You are going to sign that document and transfer the corporate liability back to Chloe before you completely ruin everything." Bradley stood up and walked over, standing right behind Brenda to block my only exit path. "Come on, Maya," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Let us go to the study and handle family business like adults. You are clearly not well and you are making a massive scene. We have the paperwork sitting right on the desk. You just need to sign on the dotted line and we can get you the professional help you so desperately need." They were physically boxing me and using their bodies to intimidate me into compliance. Aunt Shirley grabbed my other arm, pulling me upward. "Come on, child," Shirley demanded. "You are going to the study to make things right, and then we are going to lay hands on you and pray the evil spirits out of your soul." The sheer physical aggression was meant to break my spirit. They believed that if they overwhelmed me with their numbers and suffocated me with their loud accusations, I would simply cave under the pressure. They thought the traumatized 15-year-old girl they abandoned at that gas station was still inside me, desperate for their approval and terrified of their anger. They expected me to lower my head, cry tears of shame, and let them drag me into the private study to sign my own federal death warrant. They were absolutely and completely wrong. I did not shrink away from their grasping hands or cower under their intense, hateful stares. I just remained perfectly calm. I forcefully shrugged my shoulders, breaking free from the violent grip of my mother and my aunt. I slowly stood up, pushing my heavy dining chair back. I reached into my small black purse resting on the table and pulled out a sleek silver flash drive. The entire room watched my movements with intense confusion and growing dread. I did not say another word to Brenda or Bradley. Instead, I turned around and walked purposefully out of the dining room, making my way straight toward the massive living room. The congregation and my relatives followed me like a flock of confused sheep. Brenda practically ran after me, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floors. "What are you doing, Maya?" she demanded, her voice cracking slightly. I stopped directly in front of the enormous 85-inch smart television mounted on the living room wall. I plugged the silver flash drive directly into the hidden side port. I picked up the remote control resting on the coffee table and turned around to face the silent, anxious crowd. "Let us look at all the very specific prayer requests together," then I said, smiling coldly, as the massive bright screen flashed on. Before the loading screen could fully materialize, the heavy brass doorbell echoed loudly throughout the grand entryway. The sharp sound shattered the tense atmosphere in the living room. Brenda let out a massive sigh of relief, relaxing her tense shoulders. Bradley immediately checked his gold watch and smirked. "Right on time," Bradley announced loudly, stepping away from the television and walking briskly toward the front door. "We are about to handle this the right way." The congregation of church ladies and my relatives shifted their attention away from the blank television screen and looked toward the foyer. Bradley returned a moment later, leading a tall man wearing an incredibly flashy but poorly tailored designer suit. The man carried a scuffed leather briefcase and wore a slick, arrogant expression that perfectly matched Bradley's own insufferable energy. "Maya, this is Mr. Vance," Bradley said, gesturing toward the newcomer. "He is the top corporate attorney in the city. I retained him to help us clean up this unfortunate mess you have created." Mr. Vance did not even offer to shake my hand or introduce himself politely. He marched directly over to the glass coffee table resting between the plush velvet sofas. He unlatched his leather briefcase with a loud snap and pulled out the exact same thick manila folder Bradley had thrown on my desk earlier that week. He slapped the folder down onto the glass surface and pulled a heavy gold pen from his breast pocket. "Listen to me very carefully, young lady." Mr. Vance began speaking at an incredibly rapid pace, meant to overwhelm and confuse me. "We do not have time for any emotional family drama today. You are in a tremendous amount of legal jeopardy. As the documented sole proprietor of C&B Holdings, you have severely breached your fiduciary duties. The corporate veil has been pierced due to gross financial negligence on your part." I stood silently holding the television remote, observing his pathetic performance. He was throwing out random legal terminology, hoping to frighten an uneducated woman into blind compliance. "The Internal Revenue Service has already flagged your Social Security number." Mr. Vance continued pacing back and forth across the imported rug. "By 9 o'clock on Monday morning, they are going to issue a federal levy. They will freeze every single bank account attached to your name. They will garnish your wages if you even have a job, and they will seize any personal property you own. You are staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar tax debt and a guaranteed 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary." Aunt Shirley gasped, clutching her pearls. "Oh, sweet Jesus," she wailed, looking at Brenda. You tried to warn us, Brenda. You tried to tell us she was in deep trouble with the law. Brenda nodded, dabbing her dry eyes with a linen napkin. We just want to help her, Shirley. We just want to save her from herself. Mr. Vance stopped pacing and pointed his gold pen directly at my face. You are incredibly lucky your family hired me to intervene, he said, his tone dripping with condescending superiority. I have drafted an emergency transfer of liability. This proxy document utilizes a highly complex corporate loophole that will completely shield you from federal prosecution. It legally transfers the burden of the audit back to the corporate entity, allowing your sister and brother-in-law to absorb the financial blow and protect you from prison time. Chloe stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on the lawyer's shoulder. We are willing to take on this massive burden for you, Maya. Mr. Vance leaned over the glass table, resting his knuckles on the surface to physically intimidate me, just like Bradley had done in my office. Look, I know you probably did not graduate from college, he sneered, his eyes raking over my simple gray blazer. I know the legal world is very scary and confusing for someone with your limited background, but you have to trust my expertise. I deal with the Internal Revenue Service every single day. They do not care about your sob stories or your troubled past. Once they lock onto your social security number, they will completely destroy whatever sad little life you have managed to scrape together. The church ladies nodded in serious agreement, whispering prayers for my salvation. Bradley stood with his arms crossed, a triumphant grin plastered across his face. He truly believed he had won. He believed this fast-talking, sleazy attorney had successfully terrified me into absolute submission. Now pick up the pen, Mr. Vance commanded, holding the gold writing instrument out toward me. It is just a simple signature. I will even tell you exactly where to put your name so you do not get too confused. I let him finish his entire unhinged rant. I did not interrupt him once. I let the heavy silence settle over the grand living room, allowing his completely fabricated legal threats to simply hang in the cold air. I looked at the shiny gold pen he was holding out to me. Then I looked at Bradley, who was practically vibrating with eager anticipation. Finally, I looked directly into the smug eyes of the arrogant attorney. I slowly reached my right hand inside the breast pocket of my gray blazer. Mr. Vance assumed I was reaching for reading glasses. Bradley assumed I was reaching for a tissue to wipe away my tears of defeat. Instead, my fingers wrapped around the thick leather credential case resting firmly against my chest. I pulled the heavy black leather wallet out and flipped it open with a sharp, deliberate flick of my wrist. I held it up high, letting the bright living room chandeliers reflect brilliantly off the solid silver shield and my official federal government identification card. I am a senior forensic accountant for the federal government, I said. Now tell me, counselor, do you know the penalty for conspiracy to commit wire fraud? The color instantly drained from the arrogant attorney's face. His smug expression vanished completely, replaced by a pale mask of sheer terror. His eyes darted from the heavy silver federal shield resting in my palm to the incredibly serious expression on my face. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. The gold pen he was holding slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the thick glass coffee table. I stepped closer to him, closing the physical distance and letting him see the absolute certainty in my eyes. Under Title 18, Section 1343 of the United States Code, wire fraud carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in a federal penitentiary, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the completely silent living room. And under Section 371, conspiracy to commit an offense against the United States adds another 5 years to that sentence. You just walked into a room full of witnesses and actively attempted to coerce a federal agent into signing a fraudulent document to evade a massive Internal Revenue Service tax audit. Bradley laughed nervously, looking around the room. Come on, Maya, he scoffed, trying to regain control of the narrative. This is just a cheap scare tactic. You probably bought that fake badge online. Mr. Vance, do not listen to her. She is mentally unstable. Just make her sign the papers right now. Vance did not even acknowledge Bradley. His wide, terrified eyes were permanently glued to my federal credentials. He was a corporate attorney, which meant he knew exactly what a legitimate Internal Revenue Service criminal investigator badge looked like. He knew I was not bluffing. I reached down and picked up the thick manila folder he had slapped onto the table. I flipped to the very last page where the notary stamp and the legal authorizations were located. I held the document up high and pointed directly at his signature located at the bottom of the page. You signed your name as the preparing attorney for this proxy transfer. I continued speaking with absolute professional detachment. You legally bound your own professional license to a document that facilitates corporate tax evasion. Did Bradley tell you the truth about this shell company counselor? Did he tell you that every single asset they own was purchased using my stolen social security number while I was completely unaware? Or did you simply look the other way because they promised you a massive retainer fee? The lawyer began to stutter uncontrollably. I had no idea he stammered, taking a massive step backward away from the glass table. I was retained just yesterday morning. My client told me this was a simple family trust dispute. I was completely unaware of any identity theft or federal tax evasion implications. He held his hands up in a defensive surrender posture. Ignorance is not a valid defense when your signature is on the fraudulent document, I replied coldly. But if you walk out that door right now and formally report this entire incident to the Federal Ethics Board, I might forget that you tried to intimidate me in my mother's living room today. Vance did not need to be told twice. He practically lunged across the glass coffee table to grab his leather briefcase. He frantically shoved his loose papers inside, completely ignoring the gold pen he had dropped. He snapped the briefcase shut with trembling hands. "Wait, what are you doing?" Bradley yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "You are our lawyer. I paid you a $10,000 retainer fee. You cannot just walk out on us. We have a legally binding contract. I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel effective immediately," Mr. Vance shouted back, his voice pitching high with panic. He did not even look at Bradley. He just kept backing toward the grand entryway. "I am refunding your retainer fee by the end of the day. Do not ever contact my law firm again. You lied to me about the nature of this dispute, and you brought me into a federal criminal conspiracy." The church ladies gasped, clutching their chests and whispering frantically to one another. Aunt Shirley looked completely bewildered, her righteous anger melting into genuine confusion. Brenda stood frozen near the television, her mouth slightly open, unable to process the sudden collapse of her brilliant legal strategy. Chloe grabbed Bradley's arm, her nails digging into his suit jacket. Mr. Vance turned around and bolted for the heavy oak front door. He moved with incredible speed for a man wearing a designer suit. He looked like a man fleeing a burning building. Bradley let out a furious roar and sprinted across the imported rug, trying to intercept the fleeing attorney. He threw his arms out wide, attempting to physically barricade the heavy oak door. "You are not going anywhere until you fix this massive mess," Bradley screamed, his face turning purple. "I paid for your services, and you will protect my family." But the lawyer was driven by raw survival instinct. Vance did not slow down as he reached the entryway. He lowered his shoulder and barreled directly into Bradley's chest, using his heavy briefcase as a battering ram. The heavy impact knocked the wind out of Bradley, sending him stumbling backward onto the marble floor. The lawyer yanked the door open, sprinted down the stone steps, and disappeared into his car, leaving the door swinging wide open. The grand house fell completely silent again, except for Bradley's loud groaning as he struggled to stand. I slipped my federal badge back into my blazer pocket. I turned around to face my sister and my mother, who were staring at me with terrified eyes. "Your meat shield is gone," I said, perfectly calm and devoid of sympathy. "Now sit down. Both of you." Neither my mother nor my sister moved a single muscle. They were completely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of their master plan. I did not wait for them to find their seats. I raised the small black remote control and pressed the center button. The massive 85-inch television screen behind me illuminated the grand living room with a bright, blinding white light. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation of church ladies as the first document appeared on the high-definition display. It was the court decree from Fulton County, Georgia. I magnified the official seal and my mother's signature at the very bottom of the page. This is the real reason my mother left me stranded at that freezing gas station 20 years ago, I announced, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. She did not abandon me just because she was a cruel parent. She abandoned me so she could walk into a courtroom 2 weeks later and falsely testify under oath that I was a mentally unstable runaway. She legally stripped away my autonomy so she could assume total financial control of my identity without my knowledge. Brenda opened her mouth to protest, but she was hyperventilating so hard she could not form a coherent sentence. I clicked the remote again. The television screen transitioned to a dizzying web of corporate flowcharts and official Internal Revenue Service registration documents. "This is C&B Holdings," I explained, pacing slowly in front of the screen. "This is the massive corporate empire Bradley and Chloe were just bragging about at the dinner table. Do you see the name listed as the sole proprietor and chief executive officer?" Aunt Shirley squinted at the bright screen, her jaw dropping open. "It says Maya Jenkins," she whispered loudly. "That is exactly right, Auntie," I replied, nodding. "My mother and my sister created a shell corporation completely under my name. They did this so they could funnel all of their income through me, avoiding massive tax liabilities while artificially inflating their own wealth." I clicked the remote a third time, bringing up a series of premium credit card statements. Hundreds of transactions filled the screen, highlighted in bright yellow. Now let us talk about my sister's self-made millionaire status. Let us look at how Chloe really funds her luxury salon and her lavish vacations. Chloe covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. "Please stop, Maya," she begged through her fingers. I ignored her completely and addressed the stunned crowd. Every single designer handbag, every single first-class flight to Paris, and every single piece of equipment inside Chloe's salon was purchased using fraudulent credit cards opened in my name. I scrolled through the pages of maxed-out accounts, showing the undeniable proof. Chloe's highly successful business is actually bleeding money every single month. She is not a brilliant entrepreneur. She is a criminal who has been surviving entirely on federal wire fraud and severe identity theft. They used my stolen credit to build an illusion of extreme wealth so they could parade around this church community, acting like they were somehow superior to everyone else. The church ladies were absolutely horrified. The same women who had been praying for my salvation just 10 minutes ago were now staring at Brenda and Chloe with pure, unadulterated disgust. The immaculate facade of the perfect Christian family had been completely obliterated in less than 60 seconds. I brought up the final document, the official notice of investigation from the federal government showing the $4 million tax debt. "This is why they invited me to this Sunday dinner," I said, pointing at the massive debt figure on the screen. The Internal Revenue Service caught them. They were going to be indicted for tax evasion. The lawyer who just ran out of that front door drafted a fake proxy document meant to trick me into confessing to all of their crimes. They wanted me to sign a piece of paper that would have sent me to a federal penitentiary for 20 years so they could keep their diamond rings and their luxury cars. They planned to sacrifice my entire life today, right after they forced me to eat a plate of roasted lamb in this dining room. I looked directly at the flock of church ladies who were clutching their purses and whispering in absolute shock. "For 20 years, my mother stood at the pulpit of your church and cried fake tears over her lost, addicted daughter. She collected your sympathy and your prayers while she was busy forging my signature on bank loan applications. She told you I was living in the gutters, begging for loose change, while she was using my pristine credit score to finance the very chandeliers hanging above your heads right now. Every single donation she ever gave to the church community was stolen money. Every single time she hosted a charity event in this house, she was committing a federal felony. She is a mastermind manipulator who has played this entire congregation for absolute fools." Aunt Shirley slowly turned her head to look at Brenda. Her face was a portrait of pure, absolute horror. Her hands were shaking so violently that her heavy gold bracelets clattered together in the quiet room. "You lied to us," Shirley whispered, her voice cracking with profound betrayal. "You stood in my kitchen and cried. You said she was on heavy drugs. You said she stole money from your purse to buy illegal substances. You made us all hate her. Brenda backed away until her spine hit the living room wall. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting desperately around the room, looking for anyone who might still believe her lies. "Shirley, please, you have to understand," Brenda pleaded, her voice high and completely frantic. "I did it to protect the family. I had to protect our reputation." I stood in front of the television screen, letting the glow of the massive federal tax debt illuminate my face. I looked directly into my aunt's terrified eyes and delivered the final crushing blow to my mother's carefully crafted illusion. She had to say that, "Auntie," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Otherwise, how would she explain why I owned the house you are all sitting in?" The heavy silence that followed my statement was abruptly shattered by a loud, aggressive slam. Bradley slammed his open palm down onto the dining table, rattling the crystal glasses. He marched out from behind the table, puffing his chest out and stepping into the center of the living room to physically insert himself between me and the television screen. "Enough of this nonsense," Bradley shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. He looked around the room at the terrified church ladies, trying to project an aura of masculine authority. "I will not stand here and allow this mentally unstable woman to manipulate digital documents to frame her own mother. I am the man of this family now, and I demand respect in my own home." He pointed an accusing finger directly at my face. "You are a federal accountant, right? That means you know how to hack into systems. You probably fabricated all of these bank statements just to get revenge on the family who tried to save you from the streets. Do not listen to her, Brenda. Do not listen to her, Chloe. She is trying to divide us with fake computer graphics." I did not back away from his pointing finger. I simply raised the remote control and pressed the button one more time. The massive screen behind him instantly shifted away from the federal tax debt. It was replaced by a highly detailed official federal background check and a series of offshore bank transfer receipts. "A hacker, Bradley?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Or just someone who actually knows how to run a basic credit check on the man who claims to be the savior of my family?" Bradley turned his head to look at the massive screen. The aggressive red color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking suddenly very sick. "You sat at that dinner table tonight and told this entire congregation that you were a highly successful venture capitalist," I said, my voice ringing with authority. "You told my sister you were managing massive commercial portfolios and building generational wealth. You lectured me about the value of hard work while offering me a minimum wage job. Let us look at your actual portfolio, Bradley. According to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Department of Labor, you have not held a legitimate job in exactly 6 years. You were fired from your last entry-level position at a small regional bank for attempting to embezzle petty cash." Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Now wait a minute," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "Those records are sealed. You have no right to look into my personal business." "When your personal business is being funded by my stolen identity, I have every right in the world," I countered, taking a step closer to him. I highlighted a massive red column on the screen displaying a staggering amount of debt. "When you met Chloe 2 years ago, you were not a wealthy investor. You were drowning in $200,000 of illegal sports gambling debts. You were desperate because the loan sharks were closing in on you. You realized very quickly that Chloe had access to seemingly unlimited, untraceable credit." Bradley began shaking his head frantically, looking back at Chloe, who was staring at him with wide, horrified eyes. "Baby, do not listen to her," Bradley pleaded, his voice cracking. "It is an investment strategy. I was moving money around to maximize our returns. You did not marry my sister because you loved her," I stated loudly, ensuring every person in the room heard the absolute truth. "You married her because she was a walking automated teller machine, funded entirely by my stolen Social Security number. For the past 2 years, you have been systematically siphoning money from C&B Holdings directly into offshore accounts to pay off your bookies. You used my name to secure that brand new Porsche yesterday because your own credit score is in the low 400s. You are not a savior, Bradley. You are a broke, unemployed parasite who found a host stupid enough to let you drain them dry." The illusion of his superiority was completely destroyed. The arrogant man who had just tried to intimidate me and offer me a minimum wage sweeping job was now exposed as a desperate criminal fraud. He looked incredibly small and pathetic, standing in the center of the grand living room, wearing a designer suit that I had unwittingly paid for. The church ladies shook their heads in utter disgust, muttering prayers of condemnation directed at him. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came out. The great provider was nothing more than a cheap con artist who got caught. Chloe suddenly shrieked, breaking the silence. She marched over to Bradley and shoved him hard in the chest with both hands. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug into his expensive jacket. "You completely lied to me!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You told me you were managing a massive hedge fund. You told me you were buying that Porsche for me out of your own personal savings account. You let me believe I was married to a self-made millionaire, while you were secretly stealing my credit cards to pay off underground bookies." Bradley stumbled backward, trying to grab her hands to calm her down. "Chloe, please, you have to understand," he begged, his face dripping with nervous sweat. "I was going to win it all back. I just needed a little capital to place a guaranteed bet." "You are absolutely disgusting," Chloe yelled, slapping his hands away from her arms. "You are a pathetic loser. I want a divorce right now." I stood quietly near the television screen, watching their flawless marriage completely fracture. They immediately turned on each other, tearing into one another like starved dogs fighting over a scrap of meat, forgetting my presence. Brenda could no longer hide behind her golden child or her loud son-in-law. Seeing her perfect family dynamic completely shatter in front of the entire congregation, she resorted to her oldest and most heavily weaponized tactic. She collapsed onto the plush velvet sofa, burying her face in her hands, and began to wail loudly. It was a spectacular performance of maternal suffering. She cried out to the Lord, asking why her family was being torn apart. Then she looked up at me with tears streaming down her heavily made-up face. "Maya, please," she begged, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "You have made your point. You have embarrassed us in front of our friends and our church. But you must remember who gave you life. I carried you in my womb for 9 long months. I labored to bring you into this world. I am your mother, and despite all of my mistakes, I have always loved you deep down in my heart. You cannot destroy the family that shares your blood." I watched her tears fall, completely unmoved. The church ladies, who would normally rush to comfort her, remained frozen in their spots, looking at her with cold, skeptical eyes. The fake tears that had worked so flawlessly for 2 decades no longer held any power in this room. "I am going to stop you right there, Mom," I said, raising my hand to cut off her pathetic monologue. "Do not ever speak to me about giving me life when you spent the last 20 years trying to throw my life away." I pointed the remote at the television and brought the federal audit notice back to the center of the screen. I magnified the bold red numbers at the very bottom of the document so everyone in the room could see them clearly. $4,200,000, I read aloud, letting the massive number echo through the silent living room. That is exactly what this shell corporation owes the federal government in unpaid income taxes, property taxes, and accumulated fraud penalties. I turned my attention back to my mother, who was still sitting on the sofa, her fake tears drying up as the reality of the situation set in. "When you and Chloe realized the Internal Revenue Service was closing in on your massive fraud, you panicked," I explained. "You knew you could not afford to pay back $4 million. You knew the government was going to seize this house, the salon, and every luxury vehicle sitting in that driveway. So you hired that sleazy lawyer who just ran out the front door to draft a proxy document." I picked up the thick manila folder from the glass coffee table and held it up. "You called me 29 times yesterday demanding that I sign this. You told me it was just a standard family trust transfer. But we all know exactly what this document really is. It is a legally binding confession of guilt. If I had signed my name on that dotted line, I would have officially accepted full and total legal responsibility for the entire $4 million debt. I would have admitted to executing the fraud myself." Aunt Shirley let out a loud gasp, pressing her hand tightly over her mouth. She looked back and forth between me and Brenda, her eyes wide with complete disbelief. "You tried to send your own daughter to federal prison," Shirley whispered, her voice shaking with absolute horror. "You tried to frame her so you could keep living in this fancy house. That is exactly what she tried to do. Auntie, I confirmed, keeping my eyes locked on Brenda. My mother and my sister were perfectly willing to let me spend the next 20 years of my life locked inside a federal penitentiary just so they could keep wearing designer clothes and hosting Sunday dinners. They wanted me to take the fall for a criminal empire I did not even know existed. They planned to sacrifice my freedom to save their own skin. The sheer malice of their plan hung heavily in the air. The congregation members began to slowly back away toward the grand entryway, wanting to distance themselves from the radioactive toxicity of my mother. They finally saw the monster hiding behind the silk caftan and the heavy gold jewelry. Brenda realized that playing the victim was no longer working. Her grand performance had completely failed to move a single person in the room. Even Bradley and Chloe had stopped arguing to look at the massive tax bill glowing brightly on the large television screen. The sheer magnitude of their impending financial ruin was finally sinking in. Their massive criminal empire was officially burning completely down to the ground now. Brenda suddenly dropped the victim act entirely. The saintly mother vanished, replaced by the cornered, vicious predator she truly was. She stood up from the velvet sofa, her face contorted in absolute rage. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed at the top of her lungs. "It is your social security number on those documents," she shrieked, her voice echoing violently through the grand house. "It does not matter what we tried to do to you. You are the sole proprietor on paper. The federal government is coming for you, Maya. You are going to prison anyway. The audit is in your name, so you have to fix this massive mess before they arrest all of us." The room fell completely silent, terrified by her sudden, unhinged outburst. Everyone present looked at me, expecting me to panic or break down under the intense legal threat. Instead, I just looked at my mother and let out a laugh. It was not an angry or bitter laugh. It was a cold, genuinely amused laugh that chilled the room even further. I shook my head slowly, pitying her absolute boundless stupidity. "You really did not consult a real lawyer, did you? You really did not consult a real lawyer, did you?" I asked the question slowly, letting it hang in the stifling air of the grand living room. Brenda stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, completely unable to comprehend what I was saying. I turned my attention back to the massive television screen and clicked the remote control one more time. The glowing red numbers of the tax debt disappeared. In their place, a crisp, clean legal document filled the display. It was the official corporate charter for C&B Holdings, registered with the Secretary of State and the Internal Revenue Service. "Let me give you a free lesson in corporate law," I said, stepping away from the screen and walking slowly toward my mother and sister. "When you establish a shell corporation to hide your illicit money, you usually structure it so that the actual owners are insulated from liability. You hire a dummy director or use offshore accounts. But you two were incredibly greedy and completely legally illiterate. You did not want to pay the massive fees required to set up a truly untraceable corporate shield. You wanted a cheap, easy way to avoid paying income taxes on the money you were stealing." I pointed at the screen, highlighting a specific paragraph. "So you put my name on the incorporation papers. You used my stolen social security number to register me as the sole proprietor, the chief executive officer, and the single managing member of the holding company. You thought this was brilliant. You figured that if the federal government ever came knocking, the paperwork would point directly to the runaway teenager you abandoned 20 years ago. You assumed you could just live off the corporate accounts as independent contractors and let me take the ultimate fall for your massive tax evasion." Chloe was shaking her head, her diamond earrings catching the light. "That is exactly what is happening, Maya," she cried out, her voice desperate and shrill. "Your name is on the papers. You are the one who is legally responsible for the $4 million debt. That is why you have to sign the proxy and fix this for us." I stopped walking and stood directly in front of my sister, looking down at her tear-stained face. "Chloe," I said, speaking with the slow, measured cadence you would use to explain basic math to a toddler, "you really do not understand what you did. By legally naming me as the sole proprietor of this holding company to avoid your own tax liabilities, You inadvertently did something else. You made me the absolute 100% legal owner of every single asset registered under this corporation. The room was dead silent. The church ladies stopped whispering. Aunt Shirley held her breath. I own this massive brick colonial house, I said, gesturing around the grand living room. I own the imported Italian marble fountains in the front yard. I own the luxury furniture you are sitting on. I own the premium bank accounts where you stash your cash. I own the brand new Porsche Cayenne Bradley was bragging about earlier. And Chloe, I own your precious luxury salon. Every single chair, every single mirror, and every single bottle of expensive shampoo legally belongs to me. You are nothing more than an unpaid volunteer working in a building that I completely own. Brenda let out a horrible gasping sound, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically shot. No! She wheezed, her eyes bulging with sheer panic. That is our property. We bought all of those things. You have not contributed a single dime to this family in 2 decades. You bought them using my credit and you registered them under my corporate entity. I countered, my voice hard and unforgiving. According to the federal government and every court of law in this country, you own absolutely nothing. You are completely destitute. You spent the last 20 years building a massive multi-million-dollar empire of stolen wealth, and you accidentally handed the keys to the entire kingdom directly to the daughter you threw away like garbage at a freezing gas station. Bradley tried to stand up, his face pale and sweating profusely. You cannot do this, Maya, he stammered, his voice lacking all of its previous arrogant authority. You cannot just take everything from us. It is completely unethical. Do not ever lecture me about ethics, Bradley, I snapped, shutting him down instantly. You actively conspired to send an innocent woman to federal prison to cover up your illegal sports gambling debts. You are all common criminals who got incredibly sloppy. Brenda lunged forward off the velvet sofa, trying to grab my blazer, but I easily stepped out of her reach. She fell onto her knees on the imported rug, looking up at me with wild, desperate eyes. You have to sign the proxy, she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical wail. You have to take the debt, Maya. If you own the company, then you owe the Internal Revenue Service the $4 million. You are going to prison anyway, so please just help us. She fell onto her knees on the imported rug, looking up at me with wild, desperate eyes. You have to sign the proxy, she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical wail. You have to take the debt, Maya. If you own the company, then you owe the Internal Revenue Service the $4 million. You are going to prison anyway, so please just help us. I looked down at the pathetic woman kneeling on the floor and I let out a laugh. It was a cold, genuinely amused laugh that completely unsettled everyone in the room. I am not going to prison, Mom, I replied, my tone dripping with absolute finality, because I did not sign your fraudulent confession proxy. However, as the sole proprietor, I did have the legal authority to manage corporate assets in order to satisfy our federal tax obligations. Yesterday afternoon, I signed the official liquidation papers for the entire company. I sold the salon this morning to a commercial developer who is going to bulldoze it next week. I also authorized the bank to seize all corporate funds. The money is completely gone, and you have absolutely nothing left. Check your phone, Chloe. Look. Chloe frantically dug her perfectly manicured fingers into her expensive designer purse. She pulled out her latest model smartphone, her hands trembling so violently she dropped it twice onto the imported rug before finally managing to unlock the screen. She opened her premium mobile banking application. I watched the exact second her brain processed the reality of the screen. Her eyes widened to an unnatural size, and all the blood completely drained from her face. She let out a guttural, high-pitched scream that sounded like a wounded animal. The account balance displayed a massive red 0. Access denied. Account frozen pending federal investigation. You witch! Chloe shrieked, her voice tearing through the silent living room. She dropped the phone and lunged directly at me. Her hands were curled into claws, aiming straight for my face. She did not make it past the coffee table. Aunt Shirley and 2 of my older uncles intercepted her, grabbing her arms and waist. They pulled her backward while she kicked and thrashed violently, knocking over a crystal vase that shattered into hundreds of pieces across the hardwood floor. "Let me go!" Chloe screamed, thrashing against the uncles. "She stole my money. She stole my entire life." "It was never your money to begin with," I reminded her, stepping carefully over the broken crystal glass. "Let me walk you through exactly what happened on Friday morning. While you were busy posting pictures of your new diamond bracelet on social media, I was sitting in the executive office of your primary financial institution. I presented my federal identification and the official corporate charter proving I was the sole legal owner of C&B Holdings. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, I formally declared the business insolvent." Brenda was still kneeling on the floor, rocking back and forth, clutching her stomach. "What did you do to the accounts?" she moaned, rocking like a child. "I executed a complete asset freeze." I explained, my voice steady and completely unbothered by the chaos unfolding around me. "I permanently canceled every single premium credit card attached to my name. Those black cards you used to buy designer clothes and fund your lavish vacations are now useless pieces of plastic. Any transaction you tried to process over the weekend will bounce by Monday morning." I then ordered the bank manager to drain every single liquid asset sitting in the corporate checking and savings accounts. I issued a certified cashier's check for the entire balance and mailed it directly to the Internal Revenue Service to cover the massive tax penalty you created. Bradley ran his hands through his hair, pacing frantically back and forth behind the velvet sofa. "You cannot just take the cash," he yelled. "How are we supposed to pay our bills? How are we supposed to buy groceries?" "You should probably start looking for a real job, Bradley," I suggested, crossing my arms. Because the financial hemorrhage did not stop at the bank accounts. When I audited the corporate ledgers, I flagged the commercial loan you used to purchase that brand new Porsche Cayenne. Since the loan was secured under a fraudulent corporate identity, I immediately reported it to the financing dealership. I informed them that the vehicle was purchased using stolen credit and unauthorized corporate funds. Bradley stopped pacing. He looked at me, his mouth hanging open in pure disbelief. "You called the dealership," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Maya, tell me you did not call the dealership." "I did not just call them," I replied smoothly. "I formally surrendered the vehicle back to the lien holder. I revoked the commercial insurance policy and authorized an immediate repossession order. Since the car is legally registered to my corporation, I gave them the exact address of this house and the keys you so arrogantly left on the entryway table." "No," Bradley screamed, grabbing his head. "No, you did not. That is my car. It is a custom build." "You do not own anything, Bradley," I reminded him sharply. "You never did. You have been driving around in a stolen vehicle pretending to be a self-made millionaire while secretly drowning in gambling debts." "I simply returned the stolen merchandise to its rightful owner. They expedited the recovery process to ensure the asset was secured before you could attempt to hide it or sell it for scrap cash." Chloe stopped fighting against the uncles for a brief moment. She stared at me, her chest heaving with heavy, exhausted breaths. "You ruined us!" she sobbed, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "We have absolutely nothing left. We are completely bankrupt." "You bankrupted yourselves, Chloe," I said coldly. "You built a house of cards on the back of a teenager you abandoned." I just decided to finally pull out the bottom card. "Every single thing you love is being stripped away right now because it was never yours to claim. You are going to have to learn how to survive in the real world without a stolen social security number to fund your existence." Right at that exact moment, a heavy mechanical sound echoed from the street outside. A loud, aggressive diesel engine rumbled, followed by the distinct, sharp, and repetitive beeping noise of a commercial vehicle slowly backing up. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the imported gravel of the grand circular driveway. Bradley spun around, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He sprinted toward the massive front window, pulling back the sheer custom drapes. He let out a horrifying, completely unhinged scream that rattled the window panes violently. "No, stop, you cannot take that," he hollered, banging his fists against the thick glass. The entire congregation of church ladies and all of the shocked relatives immediately rushed toward the front of the house, crowding around the massive window to see what was happening. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck was currently parked directly in front of the house. The hydraulic lift was already deployed, sliding securely under the front tires of the gleaming brand-new Porsche Cayenne. Bradley watched helplessly as the highly expensive luxury vehicle he had bragged about all evening was unceremoniously hoisted up into the air and forcefully dragged down the driveway, completely out of his desperate grasp. The heavy diesel engine of the tow truck faded into the distance, leaving a deafening silence inside the grand living room. Bradley remained pressed against the thick glass window, his chest heaving as he stared at the empty space where his stolen luxury vehicle used to be. Slowly, the congregation of church ladies and the extended relatives turned their attention away from the window and focused entirely on Brenda and Chloe. The thick illusion of family loyalty that Bradley had preached about so arrogantly just an hour ago completely vanished in the blink of an eye. The toxic family ecosystem that had sustained itself on my stolen identity was suddenly starving, and it immediately began to eat itself alive. Aunt Shirley was the first to strike. She marched across the imported rug and stopped mere inches from Brenda's face. Her righteous church lady demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by the furious wrath of a woman who had just realized she was completely broke. "You owe me $50,000! Brenda Shirley screamed, her voice shaking with raw, absolute fury. "You came into my house crying about how the bank was going to foreclose on your modest little home. You begged me to dip into my retirement savings to help you keep a roof over your head. I gave you that money because you were my sister and you used it to buy a down payment for a car that just got repossessed. I want every single penny of my money back right now." Brenda backed away, holding her hands up defensively. "Shirley, please, you have to give me some time," Brenda pleaded, her voice cracking. "I can explain everything to you if you just let me speak." "There is absolutely nothing left to explain," another aunt yelled from the back of the room. "You have been lying to all of us for 20 years. You told me Maya was a hopeless addict who stole from your purse. You made me ban her from my home. You used her as a convenient scapegoat to hide your massive financial crimes." The church ladies began to completely surround Brenda, cornering her against her own expensive velvet sofa. One of the prominent elders pointed a shaking finger at her. "You stood at the pulpit last month and bragged about your massive charitable donation to the youth ministry." The elder shouted, her voice echoing with profound betrayal. "You let the pastor publicly praise your endless generosity. You bought that praise with stolen credit cards. You brought dirty, fraudulent money into the house of the Lord, Brenda. You are a complete disgrace to this entire congregation." While Brenda was being ruthlessly interrogated by the elders, my cousins turned their vicious attention directly onto Chloe. For years, Chloe had paraded around family gatherings, treating everyone else like absolute garbage because they did not wear designer labels. Now the tables were completely turned. "Look at the self-made millionaire now," my cousin Tamara mocked, crossing her arms and glaring at Chloe. "You spent the entire dinner bragging about your luxury vacation. You looked down your fake, perfectly contoured nose at my dress because I bought it at a department store. At least I actually own my clothes, Chloe. At least I do not have to steal my little sister's identity to pretend I am somebody important." Chloe sobbed loudly, holding her hands over her ears. "Shut up, Tamara," she shrieked, her voice entirely pathetic and weak. "You are all just jealous of me. You have always been jealous of my success." "What success?" Tamara laughed bitterly, stepping closer. "You do not have a business. Maya owns your business. You do not have a house. Maya owns your house. You are a complete fraud, Chloe. You are nothing but a cheap plastic doll living in a stolen dollhouse." I stood quietly near the massive television screen, watching the absolute carnage unfold. I did not need to raise my voice or defend myself anymore. The family members who had eagerly helped Brenda drag my name through the mud for 2 decades were now doing all the destructive work for me. Aunt Shirley grabbed a porcelain figurine from a side table and smashed it directly onto the hardwood floor just to make Brenda flinch. "I will take every single piece of jewelry off your neck," Shirley roared. "I will strip you completely bare." Brenda realized there was only one person in the entire room who actually had the power to stop the massive financial bleeding. She pushed her way through the angry crowd of church ladies, ignoring their shouting and their pointing fingers. She stumbled across the room toward where I was standing, perfectly still and completely unbothered by the chaos. Her carefully cultivated lies had completely evaporated into absolutely nothing. Brenda collapsed violently onto the imported rug right at my feet. The proud, arrogant matriarch who had controlled this family with an iron fist for 20 years was completely gone. She fell to her knees, her heavy silk caftan pooling awkwardly around her legs. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the bottom hem of my simple gray blazer, pulling on the fabric with desperate strength. This time there were no fake theatrical tears meant for an audience. Her face was entirely red and twisted in genuine, agonizing panic. Real heavy tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto her gold jewelry. "Please, Maya," she sobbed, her voice tearing through her throat in a raw, pathetic wail. "Please, you have to stop this right now. They are going to take everything we have." "Where are we supposed to live, Maya? You own the house, and you froze the accounts. We do not have a single dime to our names." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with absolute terrifying desperation. "You cannot do this to me, Maya. You cannot put your own mother out on the cold street. I am begging you, please help." I looked down into her wide, desperate eyes and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness. Just a profound, hollow silence where a daughter's love should have been. "You want to talk to me about the cold street?" I asked, my voice steady and quiet, contrasting sharply with her hysterical sobbing. "I want you to think very carefully about the cold street, Mom. I want you to remember the 22nd of December, 20 years ago. It was 19 degrees outside in rural Georgia. The wind was howling across that empty concrete parking lot. You told me to go inside the convenience store and buy you a pack of cigarettes. You handed me a crisp $20 bill and smiled. When I walked back out through those sliding glass doors, you told me I was going to be punished for being too slow. You told Chloe to lock the passenger doors of the car. I stood there and watched you both laughing hysterically through the glass windows before you slammed your foot on the gas pedal and sped off into the night. I was 15 years old. I was wearing a thin denim jacket over a thin cotton shirt. I stood under the flickering fluorescent lights of that gas station canopy, shivering so violently my teeth felt like they were going to shatter. I watched every single car drive past, praying it was you turning around, praying that it was just a sick temporary joke. But the hours ticked by. The gas station attendant finally locked the doors and turned off the interior lights, leaving me completely alone in pitch-black darkness on the side of a deserted highway. I was terrified. I thought someone was going to kidnap me. I thought I was going to freeze to death right there on the concrete. I waited shivering behind the metal dumpster when strange trucks pulled into the parking lot. I held my breath, clutching a broken glass bottle in my freezing hands to defend myself against anyone who might try to hurt me. I found a dirty payphone rusted to the side of the brick building. "I used the change from your $20 bill to call your cell phone. I dialed your number 29 times that night. 29 times I stood in the freezing wind and listened to it ring and go straight to voicemail. I begged you to come back. I cried until my tears literally froze to my cheeks. Do you know how many times you called my office phone yesterday morning when you realized your criminal empire was collapsing? 29 times. The exact same number of calls. You were desperate for me to pick up the phone and save your life. But when I was 15, freezing and terrified, you just turned your phone on silent and drove home to your warm, comfortable bed. You felt no guilt or remorse for leaving me behind that night. You left me there like a piece of garbage, and then you went to a courtroom and swore to a judge that I was a runaway addict so you could steal my identity. You made a choice that night, Brenda. You chose a $20 bet with Chloe over the safety and life of your youngest daughter. You chose greed and pride over every single moral obligation you had as a parent, and then you built a massive house of lies to cover up your cruelty. What is happening to you right now is not my revenge. It is simply the natural consequence of your own evil actions. I am not putting you out on the street. You put yourself on the street the second you decided to commit federal wire fraud and steal $4 million from the United States government. I am not destroying you. You destroyed yourself. I am just stepping out of the way and letting the Internal Revenue Service do its job. I am returning the heavy burden of your crimes directly back onto your shoulders where it always belonged. You wanted to use my name to build your fake empire, and now my name is the exact thing tearing it all down to the ground. You have to face the cold reality of your choices, Brenda. There is no proxy document to save you. There is no church congregation left to manipulate. There is only the truth and the debt you owe. I stepped back away from her grasping hands. She slumped forward onto the rug, completely broken by the undeniable truth of my words. The church ladies watched in absolute silence, finally understanding the true depth of the monster they had been blindly following for 2 decades. The room was heavy with the finality of her ruin. It was over. The silent finality of my mother's utter destruction hung in the air for only a few fleeting seconds. The quiet was violently shattered by a sudden guttural roar of pure masculine rage coming from the opposite side of the room. I turned my head just in time to see Bradley completely snapping under the immense pressure of his own failures. His face was no longer pale. It was flushed a dark, dangerous crimson red, and the veins in his neck were bulging visibly against his skin. He realized that without my stolen corporate money, the incredibly violent underground loan sharks were going to hunt him down and absolutely destroy his entire life. He looked wildly around the grand living room until his desperate eyes locked onto a massive, heavy crystal vase resting on the mahogany side table. Bradley lunged forward and grabbed the thick glass object, wrapping his large hands tightly around its thick base. "You are going to transfer that cash back right now, you lying witch!" He screamed at the top of his lungs, hoisting the incredibly heavy crystal weapon above his shoulder. He charged directly across the imported rug, rushing violently toward my face with terrifying speed. I did not even flinch. I did not raise my arms to protect my face or take a single step backward. As Bradley charged across the imported rug with the heavy crystal vase raised above his head, his face twisted into a mask of pure murderous desperation, I simply stared right through him. I knew he was never going to reach me. Before Bradley could take his third step, the heavy oak front door of the colonial house was violently kicked open. The deafening sound of splintering wood and shattering glass echoed like a bomb going off inside the entryway. "Federal agents, get on the ground right now," a booming voice commanded over a heavy megaphone. 4 heavily armed Internal Revenue Service criminal investigations special agents flooded into the living room. They were dressed in full tactical gear, with their weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Drop the weapon and get on the floor right now!" the lead agent screamed, pointing his weapon directly at Bradley's chest. Bradley froze completely solid mid-stride. The heavy crystal vase slipped from his sweaty palms and crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces near his shoes. The sudden influx of armed federal agents sent the room into absolute pandemonium. The church ladies shrieked in terror, dropping to their knees and covering their heads with their hands. Aunt Shirley scrambled underneath the mahogany dining table, her righteous attitude replaced by primal fear. My cousins pressed themselves flat against the walls, too terrified to breathe. They had absolutely no idea that I had notified my department director about the identity theft 2 days ago. When I first pulled up those fraudulent tax returns in my office, I did not just sit there and cry about my broken family. I immediately compiled a comprehensive digital dossier of every forged signature, illegal offshore transfer, and fraudulent credit application. I handed the file directly to the head of the Criminal Enforcement Division. They secured a federal arrest warrant within 24 hours. The agents had been sitting in unmarked vehicles at the end of the street for the last 2 hours, just waiting for my signal. When I pulled my federal badge out of my blazer pocket to terrify that sleazy lawyer, I quietly pressed the silent emergency beacon embedded in the leather wallet. The lead agent, a tall man named Harrison, stepped over the shattered crystal, moving swiftly toward the center of the room. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Bradley while his partners secured the perimeter. "Nobody moves," Harrison commanded, his voice projecting absolute authority. "Keep your hands where I can see them." I calmly walked around the broken glass, stepping out of the line of fire. "I am Special Agent Maya Jenkins," I stated loudly, identifying myself to the tactical team. "The suspects are contained." Agent Harrison gave me a brief professional nod before turning his intense focus back to the paralyzed man standing in the middle of the room. Bradley was hyperventilating, his chest heaving rapidly as the red laser sight of the agent's weapon rested squarely on his chest. "Do not shoot me," Bradley whimpered, his hands shooting straight up into the air. He was trembling so violently his knees were literally knocking together. "I was just angry. I was not actually going to hit her. I swear I was just trying to scare her." "You were trying to assault a federal officer with a deadly weapon while actively under investigation for corporate tax evasion." I corrected him, my tone flat and devoid of sympathy. "That was an incredibly poor decision, Bradley." Brenda was still kneeling on the rug, her hands glued to the sides of her head in absolute shock. She watched the tactical agents move through her pristine living room with wide, unblinking eyes. This was the ultimate destruction of her carefully curated public image. The church congregation was witnessing her spectacular downfall in real time. She was finally caught red-handed, surrounded by irrefutable digital evidence and heavily armed federal law enforcement officers. Agent Harrison signaled to his team. "Secure the primary suspects," he ordered smoothly. "Brenda Jenkins, Chloe Jenkins, and Bradley Miller. You are all being placed under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, severe identity theft, and tax evasion." Brenda let out a high-pitched whine as two agents approached her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head slowly. "This is my house. You cannot do this here. I am a respected member of this community. Please, Maya, tell them it is a mistake." I looked down at her, completely unmoved by her pathetic tears. "I already told you, Mom," I replied, my voice echoing coldly. "It is not your house anymore. It is now an active federal crime scene." One of the tactical agents grabbed Bradley's raised arms and violently twisted him around. Bradley let out a sharp cry of pain as he was forcefully slammed face first onto the imported hardwood floor, right next to the shattered pieces of the crystal vase. The cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists, permanently ending his arrogant charade. Across the room, the reality of the situation finally penetrated Chloe's massive delusion. As an agent reached out to grab her arm, she completely lost her mind. "Do not touch my designer jacket!" Chloe shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, unhinged scream. She wildly swung her arm, slapping the federal agent directly across his face with her heavy diamond tennis bracelet. It was the absolute worst move she could have possibly made. The agent immediately grabbed her shoulders, executing a swift, tactical takedown that sent Chloe crashing hard into the glass coffee table. "Stop resisting now!" the agent shouted, pressing his knee firmly into her back as she kicked and thrashed against the floor like a spoiled toddler. "Congratulations, Chloe," I said, watching her designer makeup smear across the rug. "You just earned yourself a felony charge for assaulting an officer." Agent Harrison stepped over Chloe's thrashing body and signaled to a third agent, who quickly moved in to assist. They hoisted my sister up from the shattered glass of the coffee table. Her designer dress was torn, and her perfect blowout was a chaotic mess of tangled blonde hair. The cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around her wrists, securing her hands tightly behind her back. "You have the right to remain silent." Harrison projected, his voice carrying absolute authority over the crying and the shouting. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The reading of the Miranda rights echoed through the vaulted ceilings of the grand living room like a final death knell for my mother's carefully constructed empire. "You have the right to an attorney." Harrison continued, methodically turning his attention toward Brenda, who was still kneeling helplessly on the imported rug. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The absolute irony of that statement hung heavily in the air. Thanks to the massive asset freeze I executed on Friday morning, a court-appointed public defender was exactly what they were going to get. The sleazy corporate attorney they had hired earlier was already halfway across the city, and their bank accounts held absolutely nothing. Aunt Shirley suddenly stepped forward from the back of the room. She reached into her purse and pulled out her smartphone. The bright flash of her camera illuminated the dimming living room. Within seconds, a dozen other phones emerged from the crowd of shocked church ladies and angry relatives. The women who had just been praying for my fabricated soul were now eagerly documenting the spectacular downfall of their former leader. The red recording lights blinked like dozens of tiny accusing eyes. They zoomed in on Bradley's pathetic weeping face pressed against the hardwood floor. They recorded Chloe's ruined makeup and her hysterical screaming. But most importantly, they captured Brenda. The proud, saintly matriarch of the congregation was being recorded on her knees surrounded by armed federal agents. This footage would be circulating through every single group chat and prayer circle before the tactical team even loaded them into the transport vehicles. The family social ruin within the church community was completely and permanently guaranteed. There would be no recovering from a highly publicized federal raid during a Sunday family dinner. Brenda finally seemed to realize that she was being filmed. She looked up at the sea of smartphones and let out a horrified gasp. She scrambled backward, trying to hide her face behind her trembling hands. "No, stop recording me!" Brenda cried out, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "Put your phones away right now. This is a private family matter." It stopped being a private family matter the second you decided to steal $4 million from the federal government, Aunt Shirley yelled back, keeping her camera perfectly steady. "Smile for the congregation, Brenda. We want everyone to see the real you." An agent approached Brenda, grabbing her by the arms to pull her up. Brenda violently twisted her body toward me. "Maya, please," she begged, her voice deteriorating into a pathetic, desperate wail. "Tell them it is a massive mistake. Tell them you authorized those credit cards. Tell them we were just borrowing the money and we were going to pay it all back. You have the power to stop this right now. You are my flesh and blood. You cannot let them take me away in front of all these people." I did not answer her. I calmly walked over to the massive television screen, which was still glowing with the official corporate charter of the fraudulent holding company. I reached behind the sleek display and firmly pulled the silver flash drive out of the hidden port. The screen instantly went black, plunging that corner of the room into shadows. I turned around and walked directly toward Agent Harrison, holding the small metal device out in the palm of my hand. "Here is the complete digital dossier, Agent Harrison Reyes," said my voice perfectly level and professional. "It contains every single forged signature, all of the offshore bank transfer receipts, the fraudulent loan applications, and the complete corporate tax filings for the last 5 years. It also contains the audio recording of the sleazy attorney attempting to coerce me into signing the liability transfer document earlier today." Agent Harrison took the small silver flash drive and slipped it securely into a clear plastic evidence bag. "Excellent work, Special Agent Jenkins," he replied, giving me a respectful nod of absolute approval. "The Internal Revenue Service greatly appreciates your incredibly swift and decisive action today. We have enough hard evidence right here to guarantee convictions for all 3 suspects." As the lead federal agent secured the digital evidence bag into his tactical vest, 2 heavily armed officers grabbed Brenda's arms. They roughly hauled her up from the expensive imported rug, pulling her tightly to her feet. The cold steel handcuffs snapped forcefully around her wrists, trapping her manicured hands behind her back. Brenda fought against their firm grip, her heavy gold jewelry clanking loudly against the metal restraints. The grand theatrical facade of the perfect church matriarch was now completely and utterly shattered. She looked around the massive living room, watching the glowing screens of dozens of recording smartphones capturing her ultimate disgrace. Her eyes finally locked onto mine, and her desperation instantly mutated into pure, unadulterated hatred. She bared her teeth like a rabid animal backed into a corner. "You are a monster! Maya!" she screamed, spitting absolute venom across the silent room as the federal agents forcefully dragged her toward the shattered front entryway. "You are no daughter of mine." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic words wash over me without feeling a single ounce of pain. I looked directly at her and replied calmly, "I have not been for 20 years. Glad we finally agree." The heavy tactical boots of the federal agents marched in unison across the imported hardwood floors, dragging the three struggling bodies toward the shattered front entryway. I stood in the center of the devastated living room and watched as the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers pierced through the sheer custom drapes painting the walls in frantic colors. The lead agent shoved Bradley through the broken oak door first, followed closely by Chloe, who was still weeping hysterically about her ruined designer clothes. Brenda was the last to be hauled out. She did not look back at me again. Her head was bowed, completely defeated, as she was marched down the grand stone steps. I walked slowly toward the massive front window and looked out into the affluent neighborhood. The commotion had drawn out every single resident on the street. Wealthy neighbors in their pristine Sunday attire were standing on their perfectly manicured lawns, clutching their coffee mugs and pointing directly at our driveway. The flawless reputation my mother had spent 2 decades meticulously crafting was being broadcasted as a complete fraud to the entire zip code. The federal tactical team loaded the 3 suspects into the back of heavily armored transport vans. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a definitive echoing thud. The engines roared to life and the convoy pulled away from the curb. The sirens blared loudly, slicing through the quiet, upscale neighborhood and echoing down the street until they finally faded into the distance. I turned away from the window and faced the remaining occupants of the house. The grand living room was a scene of absolute destruction. Shattered crystal covered the floor. Plates of expensive roasted lamb sat completely abandoned on the mahogany dining table. And huddled together in the far corner of the room were the church ladies, Aunt Shirley, and my extended relatives. They were completely silent, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. They looked at me as if I were a ghost who had suddenly manifested physical form just to exact biblical vengeance. Aunt Shirley was trembling so badly she had to lean against the velvet sofa just to stay upright. She opened her mouth to speak, but quickly snapped it shut when I took a step forward. Her previous righteous anger had been entirely replaced by raw, primal fear. She finally understood the immense level of power I held in my hands. I did not need to scream or throw a tantrum to destroy an empire. I just needed to press a button. I looked around the room, making direct eye contact with every single person who had enabled my mother's horrific behavior for the last 20 years. "It is over," I announced, my voice, calm and perfectly steady, cutting through the thick, heavy silence of the room. "The federal government has officially seized this entire property and every single asset inside of it, pending a full criminal investigation and public auction. The deed, the furniture, the jewelry upstairs, and the vehicles left in the garage are now federal evidence." I checked the silver watch on my wrist. "You all have exactly 5 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises immediately. Do not attempt to take anything that belongs to this house. If you try to steal a single piece of silverware or a single painting from the walls, you will be charged with theft of federal property, and I will personally make sure the Internal Revenue Service audits your personal finances next week." The threat landed like a physical blow. Total panic erupted among the remaining guests. The church ladies shrieked and scrambled toward the entryway, pushing past each other in a desperate bid to escape the radioactive fallout of the Jenkins family. They did not even bother to say goodbye. Aunt Shirley grabbed her purse with shaking hands, practically running toward the broken front door. My cousins followed close behind her, keeping their heads down and refusing to even look in my direction. They were absolutely terrified of me. They realized that the quiet runaway teenager they had mocked and shunned for 2 decades was actually a high-ranking federal agent capable of orchestrating a multi-million-dollar takedown with ruthless precision. They scrambled out of the grand colonial house, piling into their modest vehicles and peeling out of the driveway as fast as they possibly could. They wanted to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the massive federal crime scene. Within exactly 4 minutes, the entire property was completely evacuated. The driveway was empty. The grand entryway was completely clear. I instructed the remaining security agents stationed outside to secure the perimeter and formally tape off the broken front doors, leaving the toxic family legacy behind forever. I was finally left standing completely alone in the massive and silent living room. The deafening chaos of the screaming, the shattering glass, and the wailing sirens had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a profound and absolute stillness. I walked slowly across the expensive imported rug, stepping carefully around the broken pieces of the crystal vase Bradley had tried to use against me. The massive 85-inch television screen mounted on the wall was still glowing brightly, casting a stark white light across the empty dining table. The irrefutable federal bank statements and the corporate charter of their fraudulent shell company remained frozen on the high-definition display, a digital monument to their ultimate destruction. I stood in the center of the cold, empty room and closed my eyes. I took a very slow, incredibly deep breath, letting the pristine, conditioned air fill my lungs. As I exhaled the crushing, suffocating weight of 2 entire decades of trauma, betrayal, and unresolved anger, finally lifted off my shoulders. The toxic ghost of the terrified 15-year-old girl abandoned at that freezing gas station had been completely exorcised. I opened my eyes, feeling lighter than I had in 20 long years. I began to walk slowly through the sprawling first floor of the colonial house. I stepped into the gourmet kitchen where Brenda had gripped my arm and threatened me just a few hours ago. The sleek granite countertops were spotless and cold. I reached out and flipped the heavy brass light switch. The bright recessed lighting immediately died, leaving the kitchen bathed in the soft gray shadows of the late afternoon. I moved down the long hallway, passing a gallery wall filled with expensive custom-framed photographs. There was Brenda smiling benevolently in her Sunday hats. There were Chloe and Bradley posing in front of their stolen luxury vehicles. Not a single photograph of me existed in this house. For 2 decades, my absence was the foundational pillar holding up their grand illusions. I reached the end of the hall and flipped another switch, casting the fake smiling faces into total darkness. Society constantly conditions us to believe that biological family is an unbreakable, sacred bond. We are taught to forgive terrible betrayals simply because we share a bloodline. But walking through this quiet, empty house, I realized how incredibly toxic that mindset truly is. Blood does not automatically grant someone the right to abuse you. DNA does not excuse calculated federal fraud. True family is built on mutual respect, on safety, and on unconditional support. Brenda and Chloe never viewed me as a family member. They viewed me as a highly convenient disposable resource. They threw me away at a rural gas station when I was a vulnerable teenager, and then they resurrected my identity only when it financially benefited them. I did not feel a single drop of sadness for their arrests. I felt an overwhelming, powerful sense of vindication. I stepped into the private study where the sleazy attorney had tried to terrorize me into signing a federal confession. The thick manila folder was still sitting on the heavy mahogany desk right next to the gold pen. I picked up the folder and dropped it directly into the metal trash can in the corner of the room. I turned off the brass desk lamp. The darkness felt incredibly cleansing. It felt like the house was finally exhaling after holding its breath for 20 years. This property originally belonged to my grandmother. We called her Big Mama. She was a hard-working, honest woman who bought this modest brick house with cash she saved from cleaning office buildings. Brenda had completely corrupted Big Mama's legacy, turning her safe haven into a monument of stolen credit and criminal vanity. By liquidating the corporation and surrendering the assets to the government, I was finally washing away the deep stain Brenda had left on this property. I returned to the grand living room for the last time. I picked up the remote control and turned off the massive television screen, erasing the financial bank statements and the corporate charter. The final source of light in the room was the glittering crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling. I walked over to the main control panel near the shattered front entryway and pressed the master switch. The chandelier instantly powered down, and the entire colonial house went completely dark. I stepped through the broken front door and walked out onto the stone porch. The cool evening breeze felt incredibly refreshing against my face. A federal agent was standing guard near the bottom of the steps holding a clipboard. I pulled the heavy ring of house keys from my pocket and handed them directly to him. "The property is completely secure, Agent," I said. "It belongs to the federal government now." He nodded, taking the keys and stepping past me to secure the perimeter. I walked down the driveway toward my modest sedan, feeling completely detached from the wreckage behind me. I opened the driver's side door of my car and slid into the seat. My vehicle did not have a custom leather interior or a massive commercial loan attached to it. It was completely paid off using money I earned from long hours of legitimate, honest work. I put the keys in the ignition and started the engine. I looked at the dark brick colonial house in my rearview mirror one last time. There was absolutely nothing left for me to mourn. I had successfully excised the cancer from my life without compromising my own integrity. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled out of the massive circular driveway, leaving the remnants of the Jenkins family empire entirely in my rearview mirror. I merged onto the main highway, driving back toward the city as the sun began to set. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple, casting a warm, beautiful glow over the downtown skyline. The steady hum of the highway tires was the only sound inside the cabin. Suddenly, the digital display on my dashboard lit up with an incoming call. The loud ringing shattered the peaceful silence. I glanced down at the screen. The caller identification boldly displayed the name of the Regional Federal Correctional Holding Facility. It was undoubtedly my mother or my sister using their one allotted phone call, desperately trying to reach me to beg for a financial bailout or a legal miracle. I did not feel a spike of anxiety. I simply reached out and firmly pressed the red button to block the caller permanently. The ringing stopped instantly, returning the car to perfect peace. I reached over and turned the radio volume up, letting the upbeat rhythm of a classic soul song fill the vehicle. The greatest revenge was not in taking their stolen money or watching them get arrested. The greatest revenge was taking back my existence entirely and finally living a beautifully unbothered life. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Share this with anyone who needs to remember that cutting off toxic family members is not a crime, it is a powerful act of survival. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace. Thank you for listening to my journey.